Disc brakes are fantastic. They offer lots of power, they work in lots of different trail conditions and weather conditions. Lots more stopping, much less faff. However, there's lots of don't do that I see lots of riders doing with their brakes. Whenever you fit fresh pads, make sure that you bed them in, because if you don't, well, you could get excessive wear because they're not going to work as well as they could or should. You're also not going to get the performance from them that you could and should. Each brake pad manufacturer and even the brand of brake is going to have a slightly different bedding in process, but the process you'll need to research. The process is essentially the same, and that's bringing the pad material up to temperature slowly and in a controlled way. So we're not just riding willy-nilly and just blasting loads of heat into the brake. Because if you do, well, you might damage the pads themselves and they can start to glaze, which can wear out rotors, and, well, you'll just not get the actual grippy performance from the pads. What's happening when you're bedding in, as well as bringing the pads up to temperature, you're also transferring brake pad material onto the rotor. That's why it's really important to do it with either new pads or new rotors. And what that even distribution does gives you, well, the best braking that you can actually get. So bedding in your pads is a key step in setting up your brakes. I do try and flag this, and on the channel we try and flag it on lots of our maintenance videos, and that's where we're using spray lubricants or spray water dispersants. Just to be really careful, because overspray is a problem. It seems like lots of you don't necessarily understand how aerosol cans can be so effective at, well, creating an aerosol, like a mist of lubricant or water dispersant, and how, if that goes onto your brakes, whether it be onto your rotors or onto your pads, it's a bad thing. Why? Well, lots of these products have got either silicons in them or, well, lubricants, and those lubricants are doing the very opposite of what your disc brakes need to do. Of all the parts on our bike, we're always trying to reduce friction, apart from with our brakes, where we want to maximise friction. So if we're putting on something that can, well, reduce friction, you can imagine where it's not going to be very good. So do be really careful and vigilant about overspray. So if you're cleaning, let's say, your rear cassette, it's a good idea to take it off the bike. If you're going to kind of really blast and clean your rear mech, it's a good idea to try and take it off the bike, or at least cover up your rear caliper and maybe take off the back wheel and cover up the rear rotor. The cross-contamination is a real problem, so be really careful about it. Even the smallest amount of lubricant or overspray can contaminate your pads, and most pad material is a bit like a sponge. It's a porous material, so that one little drip on a rotor and then you touching the brake pads and them touching together, well, that oil can transfer into the material. So even sanding a layer off, well, it might give you some success initially. It's not going to last because there's going to be that contaminant in the pad material. Rotors you can clean more successfully with the dedicated disc brake cleaners that are out there, or some brands do recommend isopropyl alcohol because it leaves slightly less residue. But main take home is that if you contaminated your pads, the best course of action is to replace them. Of course, best practice as well is to say that you need to definitely bed in your pads, but probably give your rotors a really good clean, maybe a little bit of wet and dry on that surface as well, because they are metal, it should be less porous. Hopefully this helps. Travelling with your bike, especially in a car, it opens up lots of ways of ruining your disc brakes. First one is grease on your rotor, either from your hand or, well, from the axle itself. So that's one to watch. Next one to watch is, well, when wheels fall over or get knocked, it's quite easy to actually bend a rotor. And the final way in which you can wreck your disc brakes while travelling with your bike is, pumping the brake lever, even accidentally, where your pads smush together, and, well, it's all a bit of a tricky mess. With all of these, prevention is better than the cure, but they are curable. So first one with the rotor. Yes, you can clean it, so just be mindful about it, but a contaminated rotor, if you catch it quickly, won't lead to contaminated pads, but just be mindful about it. If you've bent the rotor, you can bend it back. You can use, well, an adjustable wrench or some of the dedicated tools. You have to be really careful, and some brake systems, the way that they're set up, where the pads run really closely to the rotor, mean that it is tricky to true. And finally, with a pad smushing together, okay, the prevention is much better, and that's putting in that wedgie thing that you got with your bike. If you've lost it, go and chat to the workshop or your local bike shop or a pal who's bought a new bike and use those travel pads. They make a big difference. But if you haven't, there's a dedicated tool to just gently return those pads back into where they should be. And do it slowly, because if they're a little bit stubborn and you haven't bled your brakes for a while, you could damage your brakes, so gently does it. Again, easy to stop doing these, a little bit harder to fix them all. But yeah, be sensible and it should be fine. Despite it being one of the most annoying sounds this side of a hand running down a chalkboard, some people do ride with their disc brakes maladjusted and pads dragging on rotors. And that ching sound or that rubbing sound really gets to me. And I get it, because sometimes, especially if you come from rim brakes or you're newer to bikes, it can seem sort of overwhelming to adjust your brakes. But don't worry, it is nice and easy. And there's like a step-by-step guide to run through. First, check that your pads aren't that worn, that the spring in the middle, which helps push them apart, isn't too worn. So that's the first point. And if they are too worn, well, we know what to do. We've got to replace them, we've got to bed them in, and then that noise should disappear. Next up is checking that the caliper is actually aligned properly. So a good way of doing this is resetting those pads, pushing them back in carefully and using the correct tool to make sure that the gap between each pad is uniform on that rotor, and making sure that it's equal and in the middle, and tightening it up. Then you probably need to check by pumping the lever just carefully that those pads are moving in evenly. If they're not, the piston seals on maybe one of the brakes might not be as it should be. Again, this is sort of easy to fix. You need to reset the pads. It can be a little bit more of a time-consuming task, but it's easily done. Again, gently move those pads all the way back into the caliper body, and then just gently pump the brake. If they're still out of whack, slide that sort of shimmy in between the pads, pump the pads all the way together, and then push the pads and the pistons back into the caliper body. Okay, if it's still not working, you might need to do a brake bleed. But again, whilst that might seem overwhelming, step by step, we've got guides for it all. So yeah, there's no real excuse for draggy brakes and noisy brakes at all. Okay, it might seem quite obvious, and I know lots of you out there care very strongly about brake fluids, but different systems need different fluids. Yes, Magura uses royal blood, Shimano uses its own mineral oil, SRAM and Hayes use DOT, and all of these fluids are different. Okay, there are some that say all mineral fluids are the same, and I'd love to be able to say, yeah, go ahead, go wild, use royal blood in a Shimano brake, but I can't. Shimano, like Magura, have developed their own version of mineral oil, and it's going to have a subtly different range of additives. So for the best performance and to stick within warranty, if you've got a Magura brake, use royal blood. If you've got a Shimano brake, use the dedicated Shimano mineral oil. And well, DOT is very, very different, and that will completely damage your seals, and vice versa. Using the wrong fluid can damage your brakes. So if you're about to bleed your brakes, make sure that you've got the right stuff. A lot of people wear pads down to the metal, but that's not best practice. And also it's worth flagging that, well, it's not just pads that are a wear item, rotors are a wear item too. And I'm gonna have a look, because my eyes, I feel, are very highly calibrated, but they're not that highly calibrated. So I can't tell the difference between the 0.25 millimeters that I would need to see with the different pads. So the best way of checking is to use vernier calipers, and you'll need to measure your pads and backing plate, or just the pad material. It depends on which brands you use. So for SRAM, for example, it's 3 mil of pad material and the backing plate. So if the backing plate is bigger, you've got less pad, and vice versa. With Shimano, it's 0.5 mil, but that's just for the pad. Magura, it's 2.5 mil for the backing plate and the pad material. Hayes is 2.75 millimeters for the backing plate and the pad material. But again, Rotors Wear too. And measuring them is the best practice. Again, if you don't have a vernier caliper, going into a shop, well, is going to be helpful, because most likely your rear rotor or front rotor is quite worn. How worn? You'll need to measure. But for Shimano, the minimum width for all of their rotors is 1.5 millimeters. SRAM states that you should replace your rotors when they exceed 0.3 millimeters of wear, or their thickness is less than the minimum value that's on the rotor. So for these XC ones, it's 1.55 millimeters. Again, my eyes are highly tuned, not really, but your eyes might be highly tuned, but it's probably best to double check with vernier calipers. There are a lot of confusing different rotor sizes, say 200 versus 203 or 180 versus 185. I've seen lots of different dimensions, but make sure that you're running the right ones. Why? Well, if you're running kind of an oversized rotor for your caliper and the incorrect setup, well, you can have rotor rubbing on caliper. And as you might imagine from sort of metallurgy in school, steel is a lot harder than the soft aluminium that most calipers are made from. So it can get expensive surprisingly quickly, but often, well, it just won't fit in. So that's less of a problem. So what happens if you're running the caliper slightly too far away? So the rotor is slightly too small. Well, this can get dangerous and surprisingly quickly. What can happen is, opposed to the pad sitting nice and evenly on the rotor and wearing evenly, so that whole pad surface is being worn down, what can happen is that you're just wearing half of the pad. So A, your braking performance won't be as good because you haven't got as much friction, you haven't got as much stopping power from the pads. And also, I've seen it with my own eyes, where half the pad is worn away, almost down to the backing plate, and the top half of the pad, well, is almost brand new. And that means when you're applying the brakes, well, one pad is actually hitting the other pad and the rotor's just sliding in between. And, well, it doesn't take a genius to work out that not getting optimal stopping power can be dangerous. So yes, it can be confusing, and there is a wonderful smorgasbord of different rotors, but check that yours are the correct ones. Okay, I'm sat in the workshop, but this bit of brake advice is actually for when you're out riding, and it's to try and sort of save your brakes. It's prevention versus cure. What am I talking about? I'm talking about being more targeted with your braking. So think like an F1 driver or a motocross racer, where you're heading into a corner, you do targeted braking where you're on the brakes, get a maximum sort of deceleration, and then off the brakes. I've seen lots of riders, and I've been guilty of it myself too, and that's letting you ride on the brakes. So just dragging the brakes on longer descents. And that's bad because it builds up heat into the whole brake system. But specifically, it can damage your pads and damage your rotors. At really extreme temperatures, your pads can glaze over and you almost get this sort of hardening of the braking surface, which means you're then pulling the brake even more. And in extreme cases, you can actually damage your rotor too. And this can happen when you're not doing this targeted braking, you're just on the brakes the whole time. And it doesn't allow the brake to do what it's meant to do. It's not letting the rotor do what it's meant to do and cool down in between braking sessions. So it's not for the workshop, but it's out while riding. And that's just be more thoughtful about where you're applying your brakes. Hopefully all these tips have helped. And if you haven't given me the thumbs up and liked this video, it does really help. So if you could, I would appreciate it. Now, if you're looking to get more about your brakes, whether you're looking to maybe bleed your brakes, we've got loads of dedicated bleeding videos for Magura, for Hayes, for Shimano, for SRAM. And if you've got any questions, of course, use the hashtag #GMBNTech, where you can ask us any questions. Hopefully all of this has helped, and if you haven't already, do subscribe. You'll get loads of great stuff from the channel, well, straight to you.